But I wanted to give an overview of Radnor. If any of you were in the class that Franco Montaldo did before this, talking about the Darby Cobbs and Tinicum and all their modeling, this is one of the municipalities at the very top of that study. And so I'll tell you what they've been doing. And all credit really should go to Radnor Township and Steve Norsini, who is their township engineer, who has been making things happen. So just for background, there's Radnor Township. It's one of the older townships. It was actually founded the same year Philadelphia was. And it's the largest municipality in Delaware County by land area and a large population. All the streams are pretty much impaired. There's our red lines. There are 3 watersheds, main watersheds, the Gulf Creek, which goes off to the Schuylkill, Ithing Creek, which joins with the Little Darby and Darby Creek, which ultimately gets down to the area that Franco was talking about in his study at the bottom of the Darby Cobbs watershed. And there's your 3 watersheds. So the township has very much taken a watershed approach to this for multiple reasons. One of the big issues in Radnor is localized flooding. And what we're finding when we look at these flooding events and the rainfall is that these are really high-intensity small storms. I mean, yeah, they get flooding when there's hurricanes and such, but it's the high-intensity rainfalls in an urban area without stormwater management that's causing these sorts of conditions, because Radnor's at the very top of the watershed. Radnor, like the other municipalities, has a pollution reduction plan for their MS4. There's the piping for it. They also adopted a stormwater fee back in 2013, which is really forward-thinking, and it's given them a consistent funding source to do this project, to do projects. Absolutely critical on getting things done. And they're also taking an approach which is a sort of a triple bottom line. As they're looking to meet their PRP requirements, they're also looking to solve flooding problems and improve community amenities. That hard balance, but that's the focus of the different projects. I know others have shared this, that flooding is getting worse in these large storms and also the intensity of the storms in the Northeast. This is from the 2014 climate report, but we're feeling it here in the Northeast. We have been focusing in Radnor on a 10-year 1-hour storm, which is about 2.6 inches in an hour. And when we start to look at that with these rainfall events that are causing the flooding, we're finding it's a pretty good correlation of these really high-intensity rainfalls. Engineers love to do stormwater modeling. It has a lot of limits and a lot of assumptions. And honestly, we're not always that good at it, but we're trying to use these high-intensity short rainfalls as a benchmark for reducing flooding and also improving water quality as we focus on volume. Just some info. So the first watershed to talk about, just briefly, is at the top, the Gulf Creek watershed, which drains off to the Schuylkill River. This is the Radnor portion of Gulf Creek. This is the Tredyffrin portion, and I think Steve was, did I see? Yeah, there's Steve. So I should just say that it's tough because Radnor's at the top of the bigger watershed, but in this area they're receiving runoff from Tredyffrin. Both communities have been built out for a long time. So there's a lot of homes built in floodplains adjacent to streams, a lot of build out without stormwater management, and it's really hard in these areas to find solutions that will have a measurable impact on water quality and on, oops, now that I'm running it in PowerPoint, it's going to do that. But anyways, when we try to communicate to the community up here, if we look at that 2.6-inch storm in that area of Gulf Creek, how much water does that generate? Well, it's enough, since we're in basketball season, it's enough to fill the Finneran Hall. Oops, no, it won't let me edit it. It's enough to fill Finneran Hall at Villanova. So how do you find room for that much water in those watersheds that are so built out? The first idea and that Radnor has pursued and is still pursuing, but you can see this green line here. This is the stream. You can see it's channelized and straightened. It turns left. It's not in its natural condition by any means. And as you might expect, as it travels through some of these lawns, people have beautiful stone walls. They like the stream where it is in their channel, and there's not an understanding of how it's been disconnected from the floodplain, that's not the way the channel already it was, and that they've lost an incredible amount of flood storage in this urbanized environment. Radnor has been working to try and improve and get the public on board with, improving their floodplain during flooding events. But as you can imagine, with private property, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. So in the meantime, they have not been just waiting for things to happen up here. They have been working in partnership, discussing projects with Tredifferent, and they've got a couple projects in the work, tree trench projects and 2 stormwater projects in parking lots, one at Cohen Park and one at North Wayne Field, where there is public property and the township can put projects in. But you can imagine if you've got that much water, this is not something that happens very quickly to make the changes that are needed. The second watershed that I'll touch on briefly is south part of Wayne, which is the upper headwaters of Ithan Creek before it joins Darby and Cobb's further down. This is Lancaster Avenue. This is Wayne. For many of you are familiar with Wayne along Route 30. Villanova's right up the road, also in the township. Another community that's incredibly built out. The streams are channelized and buried. The FEMA floodplain doesn't show up till down here, and yet this area experiences incredible flooding because that stream is buried and so much development has occurred. One of the things we found in this process is we actually had a public meeting where we talked about basic stormwater concepts and terms, because what we've found is the general public doesn't know what like a culvert means, or even a watershed. On one study, not here, we did a survey where we had people answer questions. Do you know what a watershed is? Yes. Do you live in one? No. So, so understanding, we found it's really important for people to understand people where they're at. This is not part of their daily lives. So you've got to have that language there so you can communicate with people. So that's been part of Radnor's process. So this is just, describing what a culvert is. But you can see that the streams have been buried. And so what happens at this critical area, just South Wayne Avenue, in front of the middle school, in front of the firehouse, which serves 2 municipalities, there's like 3 feet of water in these high-intensity storms. It's not just, not just inconvenience. And the police routinely have to do rescues of vehicles in this area because of the flooding. And there's a lack of understanding that we created this situation long before we were all here. When we buried the creeks in the areas where some of the flooding is the worst, there were once ponds. Before there were ponds, there were probably beavers. Anyhow, here's the Radnor Fire Company, and you can see all of that's been channelized and buried, and so we've got flooding problems. Historic maps are always fascinating. So one of the big projects that's just finishing construction is a combination of improving a stormwater feature that was built under the middle school athletic fields, as well as improving a municipal parking lot by putting a stormwater bed under that parking lot. Will this solve all the stormwater problems? No, but it'll reduce the flooding and it'll improve water quality. So you can see here what the goals are. I won't read all that out loud, but a lot of challenges with getting these projects implemented in an urban area. When the middle school was built 15 years ago, a large stormwater bed was put under the athletic fields of the middle school. And on one side of the culvert it's shallow, and one side it's deeper, and it has storage. But what happened is that during construction there were major utilities related to PICO and gas lines that they could never get the pipes to connect. So they just didn't connect everything. They never filled up everything as much as they could. Here you go. So storm sewer connections were not connected. Well, you can imagine, if any of you are familiar with Wayne, just the extent of utilities in those streets, and the challenges, just getting PICO to return phone calls is a challenge. So one of the things this project does is it connects that stormwater into this system, made a few modifications so that system functions to the maximum of its capacity, and then across the street in this parking lot, a second system is being built. It's an underground system. It's not porous paving because we have to put, fill material on top of it, but it is an underground storage system. If it can infiltrate, it will, but it's in the floodplain, it's in a wet area. So this is very much a flood reduction kind of effort in this area. And you have to watch this closely. So it's also really hard to communicate the results and the benefits in the modeling. This has all been modeled in EPA SWIM, which is a very detailed model. But in order to communicate the results, what we did is we grouped them into lighter colors, which are just a few inches of water, to up to red, which is greater than a foot of water. So when you look at, flooding and the extent of flooding in front of the fireplace before these projects go in and then after, you see the flooding levels go down and the flooding reduce. When we look at this at a bigger scale, like how much does it do all the way down through the watershed, like even through Radnor Township, by the time you get down to the township building, it's having benefits, but not benefits you can really see because this is such a large drainage area and there's so much stormwater to be managed that we need many of these projects. Like, people have an expectation that you're going to build a big project, and this is a big project. This is a $5 million project for Radnor, that you're going to solve all the problems, and that's not the case. It's one step in a process. West Wayne Preserve. So this concept, this is on Conestoga Road, adjacent to the Radnor Trail, which is the old railroad trail. If any of you have ever hiked it or biked along it, it's really lovely. And this was a concept the Riverkeep put forward back in 2007, Fred, I think, yeah. So this receives about 40 acres of drainage from Route 30 in Radnor that's currently not managed at all. And these are some of the site photos of what it looked like then and what it still looks like now. Full of invasive plants, non-native trees, a lot of dying ash, a lot of non-native trees, piles of fill from highway material, some contamination issues. The culvert is completely buried under the railroad embankment. That's one of the areas where water comes into the site. So really not functioning, lots of invasives. The joke was the indicator species are abandoned shopping carts. But it's still a lovely place, and it has access to the trail and the park on the other side. There's a dog park and a community park on the other side. So it's got high visibility, and there are some good ecological things remaining. So the goals of this project, originally as the Riverkeeper put it forward, to capture the volume, reduce downstream flooding and erosion, get rid of the stagnant water pools, restore the native community, increase habitat value, and invite people into the space, or at least make them aware of it and what's going on. So this is the drainage area. It's about 44 acres that comes to so here's the park down here, West Wayne, here's the trail. So all of that's coming in. So this part of the project involves, the original concept was to create some graded areas that could get as deep as a foot or two of water that would slowly drain out and restore the ecology. That is still the intent of the township with the current design. And they also wanted to reduce downstream flooding, because this is an area that has flooding on the roads, flooding under the overpasses that create some of those conditions we saw in Wayne. It's hard to read this. This is the engineering drawing, but this is the existing parcel where the West Wayne Preserve will be. And down here was the dog park and the parking lot for people accessing the trail or coming to the community park. And there'll be projects down there as well. These are the engineering drawings showing the design. So you can see it's still pretty similar to the original intent. There'll be some grading, but there'll be a lot of invasive removal, restoration of landscape. We cannot touch the wetlands, so that was a challenge with working with DEP. There was site contamination we had to deal with. We've gotten the permits through on that. We've gotten the wetland permits. We can't touch the wetlands, but we're going to be removing invasive vegetation and replanting them. Yeah.
Could you show me where outflow would be on this? In other words, once
right
it's
here.
full. Okay.
Yep. So there's an existing culvert. Yeah, that's another good point. Thanks, John. Yeah, getting underneath these former railroad tracks, there's an existing pipe and culvert that's still intact there. So there'll be a new control system right here. But it all has to be carefully designed and graded to not touch the wetlands, because we can't touch we can't change the wetlands.
I have another question about the culvert. Once
Yep.
it passes through, how do you control it on the other side?
It's controlled on this side. It joins a little swale right here, which will join discharges from these two projects, which come to a swale, and then there's a stream down here, and I'll show you. Yeah, it does all connect, but the control is on this side. And the control for these systems are in those systems. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, what is the swale vegetated with?
Oh, a mess. But, yeah, non-natives, invasives, fines, pretty hard to access. And once things are growing, you got to weed whack your way in. It's even in here, it's pretty hard right now to get into the areas that are wetter once things start growing. It's full of vines.
Can you give some sort of sense of the cost and the funding sources?
Yes, and we will. Tara's going to talk about, yes, we will cover the cost and funding. The previous project was around $5 million, the one in downtown Wayne, and that's mostly being paid for out of Radnor's stormwater fee and funds. So, but that gives you a sense of the scale it takes for these projects to, and that project started design in 2018, and it's finishing construction this year. So that's also the timeline it takes for a project to get through, design and implementation. This just talks about the planning. It'll be planted in, plugs, perennial plugs, etc. This has been there was originally mapped of all the invasives and tree conditions when DRN looked at it 15 years ago, and Radnor's had their arborists go out and do a very detailed mapping of all the tree species and their health. And it was just approved by the Shade Tree Committee in Radnor, because in addition to removing invasives, there's a whole planting plan of what they're going to be putting in here and how they're restoring it. All native species. And with that, I think that I'm going pretty quickly here. Oh, on the south side, as I mentioned, so this is a big lawn area called the dog park, because people, let their dogs play there. So that will have another underground stormwater storage bed, again designed to infiltrate if it can, but it's kind of a soggy area. We don't know how much it's going to infiltrate. And a porous parking lot. The existing municipal parking lot will be redone as a porous parking lot with stormwater management picking up drainage from this side. So the project has additional runoff. I think the total drainage area is what, like 66 acres now, Tara? Yeah. So, so it's been increased. Again, here's our model. So here's West Wayne Preserve right up here. Here's the flooding. The stream actually comes down through here. You can see a lot of flooding occurs along the roads right now. So this project is also designed to help alleviate some of those conditions along the roads. So it's a combination of reducing flooding in the bigger storms, holding those smaller storms and using practices intended to capture sediment, improve water quality, slow down, flatten the hydrograph, while we're improving amenities in the public space and improving the ecology. It is hard to do everything perfectly, but the idea of trying to combine as much as you can into a project is what Radnor's been working towards here. When you look at the impacts of this project further down in the rest of the township, there's some impacts, but they're not huge. And then by the time you get down to the bottom of the watershed, the Eastwick community, this is just such a little drop into such a big picture. We need so many of these before we start to make a difference. But Radnor's working at it pretty proactively. So Tara, you want to take it from here? I'm talking fast. We're going right through this. Yeah.
Slides here to answer whoever asked the question about funding money. So I guess the big picture to kind of like follow what Michelle has done, we have a problem, we have a study, we have solutions, and then we have projects. And projects, in order to implement them, I know this is all very obvious, but it's the money, right? It's the political will as well as money. So the overall two sides of this project, so there's the project that was more ecologically focused as well as stormwater management, the wooded wetland part, and then down here was all subsurface systems. The overall cost of the two of them is around construction, not design or anything that came before, is about $2.2 million. So far, my understanding is Growing Greener is a grant that they got last year. And the Growing Greener side, I'm going to talk about the 2 grant funding sources for hopeful really soon implementation. The Growing Greener one really was focused more on, both of these are the same kind of setup. There's a focus and then there's metrics, right? And so for Growing Greener, while the wooded wetland and the ecology are all significant pieces that go into the quality of the project, this was focused a little bit more on the stormwater management side and flood reduction specifically. So Michelle mentioned it's like 60, I think maybe it's more like 66 acres. And the goal of the overall project is to capture the water and then let it slowly release. And that modeling was based on, as Michelle had talked about, that smaller but higher frequency.
10-year, 1-hour storm.
Yeah.
Which seems to be a lot of the storms that are causing the urbanized flooding in the area. When our inlets aren't big enough, the conveyance isn't happening, it's just so much rain all at once. And those storms have certainly increased in intensity and frequency.
And then there are the water quality improvements associated with the holding and the slow release as well.
For the PMP.
You almost can't even see this, but they got $500,000 for this project. So of a $2.2 million budget, you're really edging along the path there. So then our next source of funding,
We hope.
which we hope, our next source of potential funding, is the NIFWIF grant. And this just went in 2 weeks ago. I think it was 2 weeks ago. But a different focus. So that's what's kind of fun for me about stormwater projects is we can overlap so many things. Everyone's goal is water quality. And then on top of that, we have the systems that manage the water and all the benefits that they can provide. So this part of the project, this grant only focused on the wooded wetland side. So where you saw all of the shopping carts and various refuse, that was only this part. So this had different metrics, and these are actually the metrics of the grant application. So those focused on trees planted and the wetland area restored. And this one has wetland restoration, but then also an upland restoration that goes around the edges of it. Similar types of metrics on water quality improvements. And
Creating pollinator habitat is a big.
yeah. And so we just submitted that one. So hopefully this is moving them towards implementation of this vision that started in 2008, was it?
7.
7? Okay. I think that was it. That's all I had to add.
So just to summarize, Radnor's really being very proactive about this for a number of reasons. And they'll have spent about $10 million on these projects so far in the past few years. So having that stormwater ordinance, which I know, and the stormwater fee has been a big part of this, but they're also spending township money, seeking grants. Just a summary sort of what's going on. And there's additional projects under study and work, and goals to do things like increase native tree canopy. As these projects happen, can we improve community amenities and recreational areas? That parking lot in the center of Wayne will now have sidewalks and trees and lights and safe access in and out. There's other amenities as well as a new parking lot that has a flooding storage system under it. So, and I think that's our slides that I just flew right through. Any questions? Any thoughts? Yeah.
I have a question about the impervious parking lots, and that is, how do you maintain them?
Oh, the pervious parking lots.
Because I know that I've seen in a couple of other municipalities that they were put in office complexes, and they never maintained them, and now they're plugged, and we have to force water down and vacuum it up to get the sand and grit out.
Yes. Well, there's a couple things. Everyone should be vacuuming the porous pavement at least twice a year. Nobody does. The first one, this could be a whole session on porous paving. The first one, back in 1986, Morris Arboretum put one in. And they just repaved theirs in 2016 because it had finally degraded. But that's a pretty good lifespan for a parking lot surface. And the bed underneath was still working, so they milled it up, replaced the pores. But we always advise for any of these stormwater systems that there's multiple ways for the water to get in, that it's not just one way. So in the past, we've done edge treatments that are open grade at Riverstone, or inlet connections, just various ways for water to get into and out of any system. So, because nature never puts all the eggs in one basket. We shouldn't design all the eggs in one basket. But yes, porous pavement needs to be vacuumed. The porous pavement standards, as I understand it, there's now a specification put out by PennDOT. And in my opinion, it doesn't have enough asphalt in it. So I've had a lot of concern lately that we're going to see those installations not hold up, not have the strength. I don't know where PennDOT, I'm not trying to diss PennDOT, it's just, I don't know who wrote that spec or why, but it doesn't. So we, in our office, rely on certain vendors that we know how to put the porous pavement in, because they've been doing it for a while. But like any of these measures, not just porous pavement, but the bioretention systems with the engineered soils. I mean, Steve, you know, we really need good standards, engineering standards. We have standards for sewer pipes and standards for asphalt, but Pennsylvania doesn't have a good...
The standards need to change over time. They need to be updated. That's the problem, is that when
Yes.
they create a standard like the PennDOT one,
Yes.
it may be good, but maybe in 10 years. It will have to go through some iterations to get there.
Yes.
And PennDOT will do that. If it's a hard thing, they might do that. So they actually may make changes, but I don't know. I haven't seen their standards, so I don't know if that is probably what we would probably like to see.
Right.
But it's probably a good start in the right direction for them.
It's good to have a standard, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like bioretention soils are another one that Pennsylvania could desperately use some engineering guidance on these kinds of stormwater feature standards and materials. So, you know, there's
So along with
consistency.
that parking lot conversation, how do you deal with old parking lots that didn't have proper drainage systems, or the parking lot was based on how many parking spaces based on square footage of the buildings?
Right.
And didn't put any buffers in, or tree lines, or shrub lines, or any type of easy access drainage versus
Yeah.
running into a storm drain?
It's going to depend case by case, but a lot of, if you're going to keep the existing parking lot, if you can depave some of it and put bioretention systems in, there's some good examples. The Acme down in Wilmington, Delaware did that. Like, find those spaces to put it in if you can, because it's cheaper to retrofit those conditions than to tear the whole thing up and put a new system in or new porous in. That library parking lot in Radnor needed to be redone. It was in bad condition, so it was time for that one to be redone. But when you're dealing with the zoning, the joke you should tell when you're trying to convince people that they don't need that many parking spaces is not to design for the 100-year shopping event. That's the joke that goes with that one.
I know.
So, okay, yeah.
Running office for many years.
It's a conversation that never ends.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what Radnor Township's doing to draw in the residents, for instance, encouraging them to put in their own pervious driveways, rain gardens, and things like that. Is anything like that being done?
They have a pretty good municipal ordinance that when anybody wants to build anything or put a shed on or a deck or something, they have to manage that volume. I think their focus has been, and they've done some they certainly do public education, and they had a whole public meeting about understanding stormwater and terms and flooding. It's a long process to reach everyone. On each of these projects, in each of these watersheds, Radnor has had public meetings for the communities of that district, you know, that watershed, and their council persons. So they have organized outreach. It's a long process to reach everybody.
Yes. Does the township put in free rain gardens into people's properties if they want to?
Not
They
that,
do that in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has a lot more money. They put in free rain gardens.
Philadelphia has the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society who helps them do that. Yeah, they do have a good program. I don't think Radnor's gotten to that level yet. Yeah, so.
Do you do anything about along those areas where you have the water streams in people's backyards? Do you do anything with when the property gets resold to address it or educate the new owners?
That's a good question, and yes, on an individual basis, the township engineer and his staff have been working to talk to people about that. But we see people whose backyards get flooded and then they buy the property next door that also floods, and they know what they're buying, and they still keep buying it. You know, there's other reasons to be there. Yeah. And helping folks to understand that what they think of as their backyard is really the stream corridor and the floodplain and the role that plays in flooding is a big, and the township has worked diligently. I can tell you that the township engineer and his staff went door to door, meeting individually with property owners to have conversations, to move that conversation forward. It doesn't happen quickly. You know, you've done you do this, so you know.
I've been there.
So my question is about, I guess, so the localized flooding. It's my understanding that one of the biggest problems about the localized flooding is the inadequacy of things like culverts and things like that. Do you know if there's being attention devoted towards improving those culverts to, for a future climate rather than the one that we, used to have? And is any of that infrastructure money getting into making those improvements?
Well, Radnor has recently improved a number of culverts, but one of the things is that you can't increase the flows you're sending downstream, and that's Pennsylvania DEP regulations for good reason. So even though the climate's changing and more water might be coming to that culvert, you can't solve that problem by sending it downstream. So you can't just make a bigger culvert.
So yeah, the problem with the little culverts is they get blocked up and they turn into de facto dams, and then it all goes over the road, and that's when you need to rescue people.
Absolutely, and it's a public works nightmare keeping those culverts and systems open. Which, if we thought about, when you talk about stormwater systems and redundancy of how water gets in, if we had a redundant drainage system where water could get into floodplains or could go places, you need multiple. Mother Nature doesn't put all her eggs in one basket, neither should we. But yeah, it's tough.
One of the things that helps with stormwater management, and I've seen this in other municipalities, is that usually you have a long stretch of road, storm drain, and we've gone through and put extra storm drains in the middle of those roads so that the water doesn't have 400 feet of water running down to a storm drain. You have it every 100 feet, and then it's gone.
Redundancy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Over and over and over.
Yeah, redundancy. Yeah. Oh, Fred.
The stormwater fee that Radnor has, I think, is like thinking they were like way ahead of the game.
They were early.
Yeah, but you hear a lot of pushback about having a rain tax, and how do other municipalities get over that? I mean, you point to Radnor, but does Radnor have any information that kind of summarizes that an individual or an EAC or somebody could go to their community, their municipality, to promote that idea? Because this is becoming a reality in part because of that rain tax.
Right, and I think they call it a fee in Radnor, so they dodged the tax issue. I know they had a whole education program when they implemented that. And they also talk a lot about not being a fee for rain, but it's a fee for impervious surfaces and stormwater. It's a fee, you have, just like you have a sewer or whatever, you have impervious surfaces, and that has an impact on the whole community.
Right.
So, but beyond that, yeah, I don't know that they're doing more education on that issue. Steve, you probably have a lot to say. I'd love to hear it.
The tax versus the fee thing, it's like, that's a hot topic right now.
Yeah.
But no, I think that in regards to, I'm from the neighboring township, so we are actually investigating a fee. But there are a lot of other municipalities too, besides Tradiffer Township where we're from. There's Lower Marion, Upper Marion. There's a bunch, like I think Abington is doing this. There's a lot of townships in the area that are starting to look into a stormwater fee. The state of Pennsylvania and the way they typically work, and I hope nobody works for the state that's here because I'm going to say something that's not so nice, but they typically like to put more things on that make it more difficult for local communities and governments to implement stormwater fees, and they've done that with a recent decision that they did between Westchester Borough and
Right.
Westchester University, because now they're calling into question a fee for stormwater, calling it a tax. And that's very bad language for most local governments. Nobody wants to have a tax to add, do that. Politicians don't like to run for election and have to say that they raise taxes. And stormwater, there's people who are affected by stormwater and people who are not affected by stormwater. So that's always difficult because not everybody feels that they're going to get the benefits from that. And
Right.
so I think, in general, there are a lot of municipalities that are interested, both because they have, DEP has put regulations for their MS4 and their pollution reduction plans, so they have to do water quality improvements and projects. So they have to find ways to fund that. So the fee has been one mechanism to consider to do that. There's not enough money out there. I would say from stormwater, funding is the sole biggest thing. Most municipal governments or even state and county governments would say they would do projects and they would be supportive of them, but they just don't have the money. And that's been, we've been talking about that for years and years and years. That nothing's really, there is more money out there, and the Radnor example is great because they have money, but there are
Some money.
Some money, yes. They have some money, yes. But I mean, I had a quick question for you on the NIFWIP. How much did Radnor ask for their NIFWIP grant?
400?
Yeah.
Yeah.
About 400?
Similar.
Similar to the Growing Greener?
We quantified all the costs related to the ecological restoration and asked for half of
And
it.
that has a 50% match, right? So it does. So there's so the fee is helping in that part because they have money set aside that they can use for these other grants for their match money.
Yep, exactly. So they're also, I mean, the big thing they're doing is they're taking a watershed approach. They're trying to combine all the benefits of water quality, ecological restoration, community amenities, and flood reduction. And flood reduction is what gets the crowds out. You don't get crowds out for water quality. They all come out when it floods. So that's where you can, if you can bring that together, that's where you get people. And they're also trying to help people have the language to understand what these issues are, to be part of the conversation. So, any other, Joe?
At the same time that you're pointing out how important language is, the idea of the rain tax versus
Fee.
the impervious surface fee.
Yeah.
Maryland has been pushing that, and it's remarkable. Republican-dominated counties, and so they have a little bit easier situation because they're doing these things at the county level, not at the hundreds of township levels. But what was discovered and made transparent, but only late in the process, was that there were business groups that were coming together to oppose it and sort of force this language of rain tax because they were responsible for the vast majority of the impervious area, and they didn't want to pay their fair share, so they got the population up. Oh, now we're being taxed for rain. What's next, air? And unfortunately, in some of the more conservative communities, they dropped the rain fee or the impervious surface fee to $1 an acre or some ridiculous, ineffective mechanism. The other thing, and I don't know how Pennsylvania does it, but the counties, the MS4 counties, so counties that are now working on reducing non-point source runoff, are tasked with reducing their effective impervious area by 20%, which maybe isn't such a big deal for a township, but for like PennDOT, that's a really big driver for reducing impervious surfaces or for compensating for them with improved
Impervious credit.
Yeah.
Mitigation, running.
Well, yeah.
You guys also have, for your stormwater, the environmental site design, the ESD process.
Yes.
Stu Comstock, who,
Yeah,
I'm like a
that's only
groupie
good for
with
new
Stu.
sites.
He's amazing. But
Right? That's only good for new sites, and most of our problems
our existing
are already built
sites.
out.
But still, shifting the direction to volume management and water quality is the big change that Maryland has done more successfully. Yeah. So good. Yeah, John.
I think the question in my mind is how do we export? Because you're doing some things here that are very forward-thinking. First of all, big storms, things that are not occurring every year or 2 years, but they're so big. And the second thing is you're not leading with credits. This is not dealing with MS4 PRP credits first. And as a result, in my mind, you've got a different outcome. And you're dealing with the real problem. And most of our municipalities are dealing with it in the wrong way, and that is credits first. Get off my back. How do we switch that? So these guys have been obviously conscious of flooding. Westchester has some flooding, for example, has a fee. The university fought it, so that was actually the state fighting the municipality, and that's unfortunate depending on how it cascades. But how do we take the same mindset, but you don't have so much flooding? You don't have your main business or residential areas going underwater easily. But the same approach is really at the core of what urban stream people have been saying for 2 decades. So how do we switch this conversation?
Boy, John, I don't know. I got to say that in Radnor, a lot of credit has to go to Steve Norsini because he's championed this through and he takes the heat, from the public and everything else. He's been the advocate of this watershed thinking approach. And they do have the flooding issue. But I don't know what the answer is. The issue of drinking water quality resonates with people. Like when people understand where their drinking water comes from, sometimes that helps. But the flooding gets people worked up and emotional and they show up. So I don't have an answer for that. I don't know if anybody else does.
Is there truth in the statement that we're already paying for the impacts of flooding and infrastructure maintenance and all that? We're already paying for it, but we don't see it because it just goes into a general fund. So a stormwater fee just like allocates that money to a designated purpose. So I don't. In New Jersey, we're trying to, with the new stormwater rules, MS4 rules, we're trying, in their supplemental questionnaire, they're like trying to zero in on what are some of the costs that each municipality is already charging for that, so that we can isolate it, and make it more clear, more evident.
Yeah. Thank you all for your thoughts. Thank you for listening. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.